Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hey, it's all about Taqiyya today, right? Thanks for joining me. I hope you can hear me. And if someone will be so kind as to tell me they can hear me, that would be great. First, I'd like to apologize about yesterday. Um, I got delayed. I sound like Gandalf. In the movie where Frodo's in Rivendell and he's, what happened, Gandalf? And Gandalf just says, I was delayed because, Saruman threw him up inside Orthanc. Anyway, that's actually a pretty accurate analogy now that I think of it. But anyway, my profuse apologies to anyone who came yesterday and waited and waited and waited. But as you can see, I'm outside of my element and things were a little harder. Yes, I'm alive. Thank you. Than I supposed. And so I was late. Anyway, without any further ado, let's get to it. Let's talk about what we were going to talk about. Taqiyya. Man, that brings back memories. Unbeknownst to many of you, I actually had a lot. I did so many deep dives in my early years about Taqiyya. In fact, if you know a thing or two about Taqiyya, there's a good chance it traces all the way back to stuff I wrote back in the early, like 2007, 8, and 9. And I mean, if these stories are old, but so what basically happened is around 2005 or 6, I was working at the Library of Congress. And that's when, maybe you heard the story, I found all these Arabic writings by Ayman Zawahiri, by Al-Qaeda, by Osama bin Laden, et cetera, et cetera. Sheikh Raymond, that's right, thank you. It's late where I'm at, so indulge me. Anyway, I came across all these Arabic writings, and out of it came the Al-Qaeda Reader, my first book. And what really struck me, this was my first introduction to the concept of Taqiyya. Actually, Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri were talking about it, and they were practicing it. And we're going to get into the deep definition of the word Taqiyya, but for intents and purposes right now in this intro, all you need to know about Taqiyya is it's just sort of a legal license for Muslims to deceive, okay? But we'll get into the nitty-gritty about the actual definition, the doctrine, all the other related doctrines. But that's how I was first introduced to it while researching and reading these Arabic texts at the Library of Congress first by Al-Qaeda, but then so many other. I have to tell you, I really miss working at the Library of Congress. It's no one really understands it, but if you're a bibliophile and a researcher, it was just, I mean, not just because it's the Library of Congress, which has books from everywhere around the world. I think every country would send 2 copies of whatever language, and of course, all English language, American books that you can find anywhere, you're going to find them there. But as an employee, I actually had access to them, direct access to the stacks. If you're just part of the general public, you can use the books, but you have to actually submit a request, and then someone like me would go get it. Usually I would go, and then I'd get lost reading what that person wanted. No, I'm kidding. But anyway, I'm just thinking back to those days and how I came across all this stuff. So there were a lot of writings about Taqiyya, about Islamic doctrine and deception, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, Al-Qaeda was engaged in Taqiyya, deception, which was basically, and that's why I wanted to write the book and translate Al-Qaeda Reader, because they had been messaging the West with communiques saying the grievance mantra, okay? We attacked you because you attacked us. If you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. There's nothing doctrinal about it. We're not obligated to do this or anything like that. But yeah, you started hostilities. What do you expect from us? That was their message. And all the Western media, of course, would disseminate it to the Western public, American public. And then that's when I came across the writings where they literally said, yeah, we have to speak that way to them because that's part of the deception, part of the warfare strategically. But at the same time, if you know the difference between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, so ISIS, as we know, speak very frankly, and they say things like, they wrote an entire article about why it's titled, literally, Why We Fight You, Why We Are Fighting You, and it was addressed to the West. And it lists the numbers. And the number one reason is because we hate and fight you because you're an infidel. Okay. So it's, as I always say, ISIS is refreshingly honest, at least. Al-Qaeda didn't do that. Al-Qaeda actually still played the sort of grievance thing. But then in their communiques and writings in Arabic to fellow Muslims, they sounded like ISIS. Okay, and we'll get into that. So that's what struck me. That was my first sort of initial experience with Taqiyya. And then I did a really deep dive into the doctrine. I was very much interested in doctrine back then. We're talking again, like I said, 2005, 6, 7, 8. And all those years I was working with the Library of Congress. So I had a lot of access to all these books, Arabic books. But I made a lot of photocopies, I'll have you know, when I left. And my earliest writings, if you look at them, actually one of them is called Truce or Taqiyya. And it was about how bin Laden's always offering truces and an olive branch. And the point of the article would be, well, is that what it is? Or is it just Taqiyya? And then I would get into the concept of Taqiyya. And before long, I sort of made a name as the guy who knows about Taqiyya. And I was actually commissioned by, this is kind of a funny but sad story. I don't know if you remember, I don't even know if they exist anymore. They were called Jane's Islamic Affairs Analyst. It was a journal, and I think it was subscription only. I don't even remember if it was online or just a physical magazine journal. Anyway, it was very analytical. It was sort of made for the intelligence and military community. And one of their editors commissioned me to write about Taqiyya. And I did. I wrote a whole essay, and they published it. And before long, I just remember, and he loved it. And then I started getting calls from him, and he was kind of a younger guy, so I feel bad. Actually, he was probably my age. I was a younger guy too. We were probably both early 30s. And but I felt bad for him. His voice was shaking, and he was like, "Oh, what should I do?" I don't know if they fired him, but he got in a lot of trouble because he actually allowed what I wrote to be published. That essay about Taqiyya. And I don't know, he panicked, and then but they couldn't really withdraw it. It wasn't that easy back then. Again, it's physical copies. But I guess they commissioned some other guy who addressed what I wrote, and basically he was saying, well, he's right in some areas, but he's really exaggerating and kind of pulling it out of context in others and whatever. And I actually responded to that fellow, I forget his name, in another article. And so I did create a little controversy back then about Taqiyya. And then, because I was in preparing for this live stream about Taqiyya, I was doing a little research, and I was reminded that on February 12th, 2009, I was actually asked, and I did testify before the U.S. House Armed Services Committee. And it was called Strategies Confronting Extremist Ideologies. And if you want to see my actual testimony and my document, you can probably just put in what I just told you, and it'll come up. But a big portion of it was talking about Taqiyya, about how Westerners are not really cognizant of this sort of license to lie, which we're going to get into. And anyway, okay, so that's the background of why I've always been interested in this topic of Taqiyya. And as you're going to see, the word Taqiyya is kind of it's a little misleading, and I'm going to get into that, but it's become sort of an umbrella term that covers all sorts of different manifestations and forms of Islamically sanctioned deception. All right, so let's get into it. That was my preamble. So the doctrine of Taqiyya, now the first thing you'll notice, and I always encountered this, and the guy who tried to rebut me for Jane's Islamic Affairs Analyst, he brought this up too. And you'll always hear this: Taqiyya is a Shia thing, okay? The Shias, as opposed to the Sunnis, being the two main Muslim denominations, as it were. Of course, Sunnis far outnumber them. Something like 90% of the Muslim world is Sunni, maybe 10 is Shia. But you'll always hear the number one sort of rebuttal is, well, that's a Shia thing. It just deals with that small minority, not 90% of the Muslims, okay? And, well, there's a reason for it. Okay, so actually, yes, the Shias, you can say they've really perfected the art of Taqiyya. And by the way, just to make this timely and relevant, don't forget, Iran is a Shia nation, okay, for what that's worth. But here's why it's always associated with the Shias. The Shias, because they were the outnumbered minority amongst the Sunnis, and the Sunnis were out to kill them because the Sunnis are out to kill everyone. Well, no, especially the Shias in this context, because they're heretics. So the Shias living amongst the Sunnis, being far outnumbered, had much more reason and cause to dissemble their beliefs, okay, and hide their true intentions. All right. So that's why for centuries, the Shias have been associated with Taqiyya, to the point that, as we'll see, it's almost become part of the culture. It's so imbibed and interwoven with their culture because they always lived in fear of the other Muslims, the Sunnis. And so they would, for example, act 24/7 like they were Sunnis. They would pray like Sunnis. They would follow the exact Sunni teachings and formulations. But in their heart, they remain Shias. Okay. So that's why it's on the one hand conflated with the Shias as if it's only they who do it. It's not. But of course, historically, they had more reason and cause to do it. Okay. And I would say because of that historical circumstance, it is sort of second nature to the Shias to sort of always live with this sort of, I don't want to put it this way, but like a duplicitous veneer around the other. Okay. We'll get into it a little more. But now, before we proceed, and here's one of the issues. This is actually one of the things that I mentioned at that U.S. Armed Services Committee is, the way Westerners project. So one of the first things we have to get over is that, well, many Westerners come from a Christian background, and the historical example of Christians is the exact opposite, right? When Christians in the early tradition, in the early centuries, were caught by the Romans, let's say, or whoever, Nero, the types that persecuted them, and they were told to renounce Christ or whatever, engage in pagan activities and participate, and they would not renounce him, and then they would be tortured and killed. That is somehow, that's in the consciousness of Christianity. Okay. It still even happens today in faraway lands where Christians refuse to. I just wrote the other day on Substack, yesterday, the 6th was this is the thing, if you look at the calendars, there's hardly a gap. You won't find a day that's like martyrs, Christian martyrs who were killed by Muslims quite often. And so I wrote about the 42 martyrs of Amorium in Anatolia, Asia Minor. This is the Byzantines, as they're called, Greeks, Orthodox, who were again, they were, Amorium was sacked, they were taken, these 42, and they were held captive, and they tried to convert them because these were nobles and military men. They weren't just rabble, and they wanted to bring them on, the Muslims, to convert them. And they just wouldn't, no matter what, no matter how much it would cajole them or try to entice them over or torture them. And then finally they took them to the Euphrates and beheaded them, all 42 of them. And why I remembered it is because less than a month earlier, on February 15th, fast forwarding to today, or 11 years ago in 2015, is, of course, the infamous video of 21 Copts, or 20 Copts and one West African man from Ghana, who, same reason, they refused to renounce, were taken by a body of water in Libya, Sirte, and beheaded. Okay? So that kind of thing is sort of built in the Christian consciousness, which is we don't lie about our faith, even at the edge of the sword. Now, of course, a lot of people have throughout history, and now, but it's not seen as a good thing. I'm reminded of the Donatist controversy, for example, around the time of St. Augustine, which was basically after Christianity became normalized and was given free reign, essentially, with Constantine, and afterwards, a lot of the Donatist Christians felt that the other Christians who when they were persecuted actually did act like they were not Christians. A lot of them did, publicly participate in pagan practices. But then when it ended, they wanted to come back to the church, and then the Donatists were kind of like, no, you're not real Christians because you actually, and it was mostly, I think, geared against clergymen. Like they weren't allowed to, they didn't want them to engage in, administering the Eucharist or performing priestly functions because they were seen as tainted. Okay, so I tell you all this to show you that the Christian idea is that, when it comes to someone who is actually attacking you or threatening to kill you or whatever because of your faith, it's always been the Christian thing to at least want to not to resist unto death. Not that all of them did it, but the ones that didn't do it were not exactly proud of themselves and patting themselves on the back and feeling good about it, I'm sure. Okay. And a lot of Westerners, because of that sort of mentality, project it on other religious people, including Muslims. So they think, obviously Muslims, if you threaten them and say, "Hey, recant, renounce Muhammad," there you'll still have a core of them who'll say, "Never, and I'll die." Nope, not at all. Not like that at all. In fact, Muhammad himself approved of his own followers denouncing him. Okay. And condemning him publicly as a stratagem for themselves, for example, to not get hurt or killed, and also as a stratagem of war to kill the infidel. And I'll give you some examples. Okay, so very, very different how, let's say, the Muslims and Christians approached it. And that's the big problem because, again, too many people from a Western or Christian point of view just project themselves constantly, okay? And they don't get it. All right. So now let's talk about the word taqiyya and where it comes from. And also well, before I forget, I was talking about the Shias and how they were and how they had to practice this sort of internalize their religion because they were living amongst the Sunnis. Now, as fate would have it, the Sunnis find themselves in a very similar situation, don't they? Because the Sunnis are living in Western nations. They're the minority. And now they fear for themselves, okay? And so they have just as much reason as the Shia to dissemble their true beliefs and, their true intentions. So just something to keep in mind. All right. Now, one of the assets that I was able to access at the Library of Congress again, and I did actually end up procuring my own copy of this book, but it's the only book that I know, and it's written entirely in Arabic. And there was a time where I was going to translate at least significant portions, and I did actually translate excerpts, but I actually for a while was going to translate the whole book. But it's called in Arabic Taqiyya fil Islam, which means Taqiyya in Islam. And it was written by a professor who actually taught at the American University of Beirut. And his name, he died, I think, a few years ago. His name was Sami Mukarram. Okay. Now, I read this book inside out, and it was, well, let's just say very, very eye-opening and very, very well documented. Okay. And it completely demonstrates the ubiquity and broad applicability of the concept of taqiyya. So here is one of the excerpts that I did translate. Let me read it to you, what he wrote. Now, he's the expert. All right, I defer to him and his book. And he's Muslim. I think he's probably, I think he was Druze. So, technically not Muslim, obviously, but he was from the Middle East. He's a scholar. And this is, by the way, when I've used this guy and I've quoted him, even though he's a professor, the number one response from Muslims is, well, he's a Druze. What does he know about Islam? Okay, so by that logic, nobody can object. You can't objectively study a religion unless you're a member of the religion. All right. Anyway, so here's a quote from him. Quote, Taqiyya is of fundamental importance in Islam. Practically every Islamic sect agrees to and practices it. We can go so far as to say that the practice of taqiyya is mainstream in Islam, and that those few sects not practicing it diverge from the mainstream. Taqiyya is very prevalent in Islamic politics, especially in the modern era. All right, so there you go. So to reiterate, taqiyya is not just this sort of esoteric thing that the Shias do. This man is telling you it is just part and parcel of Islam. Every sect, to one degree or another, is engaged in it. All right. And the reason, like I said before, that the Sunnis were not, historically, what did the Sunnis do? Well, they conquered the vast majority of, the early, the Christian world, actually, a huge chunk of it, Persia in the 7th century. They were the force to be reckoned with. Everyone was fighting them and running away from them. And so they had nothing to dissemble. They had no reason to fear the Sunnis historically. But like I said, now they are in that position where they're living in the West. So they are now just like the Shias, and they have been for decades. actually centuries, because of course the Islamic world has been significantly weaker than the West for centuries. So they've had the same exact circumstances and reasons to engage in the same sort of thing. All right, now let's talk about the word taqiyya. Now, it's a complicated word. It's the word taqiyya never appears, for example, in the Quran. But what you do have are other words. You have the root of the word taqiyya, and it's used often like a verb, but sometimes as a noun. And the root, it's kind of tricky. There's trilateral 3 consonant roots, and you would call it waqayya. Okay, and from that we get the similar root taqiyya or taku, which means to fear. Okay, so they actually get conflated very often, and even Islamic scholars will tell you taqiyya comes from the word taku, to fear. Okay, but taku and taqiyya come from waqayya. Okay, and the root of that word, which taqiyya comes from, means to protect something, to guard something, to shield something. And so taqiyya means exactly those words: protect, guard, shield. But you can also see how it's connected to the word fear. So theoretically, it's because, so for example, Taqi Allah is like someone who fears God, and it's considered he's pious, okay? But the root word for taqiyya in this context and the meaning is you're guarding something, you're shielding something, and you're protecting something, okay? So now here's a classic verse. There's probably 3 or 4 verses, but I'm just in the Quran, but I'm just going to give you the main one that is really very, very clear, and that's Quran 328. Surah 3, Ayah 28 for the purist. And it goes as follows. This is my translation. Quote, let believers, Muslims, not take infidels, kuffar, non-Muslims, for friends and allies instead of the believers. Whoever does this shall have no relationship left with Allah, unless you but guard yourselves against them, taking precautions. Okay, now you see the word guard yourself and precautions. That comes from the word waqayya, and so it's taqa, and I'm forgetting the exact ending of the verb, but it's taqa something depending on the ending, and the precaution is again like taqa. You can look it up. Anyway, so that is what it means. That's the verse. So what does that mean? Whoever, look what it's saying. You believers do not befriend the infidels. We've been through this one a million times, right? It's the doctrine of wala wal bara, loyalty and enmity, love and hate, where Muslims must be loyal to fellow Muslims or love fellow Muslims, if you want to use that sort of word, and they must hate and disavow and reject the non-Muslim. So this is one of those verses, but it has a caveat at the end, doesn't it? Taqiyya. So it says, again, to reiterate, let believers not take infidels for friends and allies instead of the believers. Classic definition of the doctrine of loyalty and enmity, love and hate. It continues, whoever does this shall have no relationship left with God, Allah, unless you are just guarding yourself against them, taking precautions. So how was that understood? Well, let me tell you what the ulama said, the Islamic sheikhs and scholars throughout the centuries. So here's Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari, who died around 923 AD. So this is one of the earliest exegetes and commentators on the Quran, and his multi-volume works are go-to standards till this very day. Here is how he explains the verse I just read to you, 328. He writes, quote, if you, Muslims, are under their, non-Muslims, authority, fearing for yourselves, behave loyally to them with your tongue, while harboring inner animosity for them. Know that Allah has forbidden believers from being friendly or on intimate terms with the infidels rather than other believers, except when the infidels are above them in authority. Should that be the case, let them act friendly towards them while preserving their religion. Let them, Muslims, act friendly and loyal to non-Muslims because they're above them in authority, while preserving their religion. Okay, so classic example of Taqiyya. Well, you just got it right here. Let me give you another one. Here's another very famous commentator of the Quran and exegete, Ibn Kathir. He died, so we're fast forwarding. Tabari dies around 923. Ibn Kathir dies around 1373. Okay, another prime authority on the Quran. He writes about this verse. This is his exegesis. He writes, quote, "Whoever at any time or place fears evil from non-Muslims may protect himself through outward show. And then as proof, he quotes one of Muhammad's close companions, whose name is Abu Darda. And Abu Darda apparently said, quote, "Let us grin in the face of some people while our hearts curse them." Okay. So I think it should be pretty clear what we're dealing with here. For the exegetes, for the classic commentators of the Quran, which are still being read till this very day, Taqiyya, according to that verse, 328, that whole doctrine derived from that verse about don't befriend the infidels unless you are guarding yourself. That's what it means. Basically, yeah, you can say, act like you're their friend. You can act like you're loyal to them, as long as it's just, but your heart stays true to Islam. Okay. And we're gonna get into so many examples of this. There's no end of the examples of that sort of thing happening all the time. Okay. Now here's the thing. For me, as someone who likes to be pretty very objective and a purist when it comes to these terms, one of the objections I've heard often, and I think, and I sympathize with it, okay, is that, well, Taqiyya, as you just described it, is just as I just described it. Is all these are examples of non-Muslims are above Muslims and somehow threatening them, and Muslims have no choice but to engage. They don't want to die, they don't want to be killed, so they're going to pretend. Okay, just like certain Christians did. Like I said, that wasn't the ideal, obviously, for Christians, but it's happened. So these are just poor Muslims. They don't want to die. So, okay, they've been given a dispensation to pretend while they're under infidel control. And so that's Taqiyya, according to the exegesis I've read, and according to the verse itself, right? Now, and now here's the issue. Number one, I agree nominally that is the classic definition of the word. The problem, however, is because deception on many levels in Islam is validated, and we're going to look at them. It's somehow the word Taqiyya has become an umbrella term to cover all of them, which means even active forms of deception. So not just I'm trying to protect my life because the infidel's above me in authority and I'm going to pretend not to be a Muslim. It's actually also conflated and used as a term to justify actively deceiving the infidel as a way to score a point against them for Islam. And I'll give you a perfect example, because Sami Mukarram, the author of that Arabic book about Taqiyya, he uses it frequently. He'll refer to anecdotes, which I'll share with you right now, presently, and about basically as basically Muslims lying so they can attack and kill non-Muslims. Okay, this has nothing to do with protecting themselves. And he will say, yes, this is a form of Taqiyya. So the word has really grown and become very elastic, and beneath it are all forms of deceptions, which are, to one degree or other, legitimate in Islam. Okay, and we're going to look at it. I know what I'm saying is a mouthful, and a lot of people might object to it. But I'm going to give you the receipts, as they say. Okay, let's start with Muhammad, the most perfect human, as according to the Quran, and therefore every Muslim should emulate him, hence the Sunnis. Now, he took a very expedient view on lying, okay? It is well known, well attested to, every Muslim knows this, that, for example, Muhammad allowed lying in 3 situations. 1, to reconcile two or more quarreling parties. So, your sister and your brother are fighting about something and you want to bring peace. So you go tell the sister, hey, he really feels bad and he wants to apologize. But he's shy. And then you go tell the brother, hey, she feels bad too, but it feels awkward. Maybe you just walk by her and smile. And then, maybe they both work at it and voila, reconciliation. Okay. It sounds good, right? I suppose would be called a white lie, but for a prophet, for the man, the most perfect man, to be advocating this, well, I don't know. What would Jesus do? Okay, so that's the first one. And then the second one is also pretty standard. It's in war. Ah, so you can lie in war. Okay, that's pretty standard. Who doesn't engage in deception while involved in war? The third one is you can lie to your wife. Yeah, or to placate her. So you want to placate her. You don't have to tell her the truth. Why upset her needlessly? Okay. Why tell her something that she doesn't need to know this? Okay. So Muhammad thought that was okay. And Muslims think that is okay. Okay. Now, and so here's the quote I'm looking at that I wanted to show you, where Sami Mukarram, the author of the book, he writes this, quote, Taqiyya in order to dupe the enemy is permissible. So you see how the word again, Taqiyya, just gets conflated with generic deception, because we just saw deceiving the enemy in war is completely legitimate, according to Muhammad. And the scholars refer to it as Taqiyya. Okay, so there you go. Now, what's interesting, let's look at the war aspect, which is relevant today, is that a lot of the Islamic scholars, if you look at them through the ages, they actually thought that deception was not only integral to warfare, but actually superior to fighting and valor and that sort of thing. Here's a quote from Ibn al-Arabi, and he declares that, quote, in the hadith, the sayings and deeds of Muhammad, practicing deceit in war is well demonstrated. Indeed, its need is more stressed than the need for courage. There you go. And what did he base this on? On the hadith, on Muhammad's life. Okay, which was, and we just saw Muhammad did engage in a lot of trickery. Let's just say he was a great makkar, like Allah, a schemer, and maybe we'll get into that. But so, and then here's another one. Ibn al-Munir, another alim, scholar, sheikh, writes, quote, war is deceit. That's what Muhammad says, and we're going to see the context. But he continues, war is deceit, i.e. the most complete and perfect war waged by a mujahid, a holy warrior, is a war of deception, not of confrontation, due to the latter's inherent danger and the fact that one can attain victory through treachery without harming oneself. How novel. And then here's Ibn Hajar, who died around 1448. He counsels Muslims to, quote, take great caution in war while publicly lamenting and mourning in order to dupe the infidels. This is pretty relevant stuff to be cognizant of, don't you think? All right. Now, here is one of the main examples. Actually, this is where the phrase war is deceit comes from. Muhammad said war is deceit. Everyone knows this. Muslims are fond of repeating it and imbibing it and living it. And here's where it comes from. It goes back to what's called the Battle of the Trench, which occurred around 627. And this battle basically pitted Muhammad's followers against several non-Muslim tribes, okay, who were known as Al-Ahzab, the parties, the factions. And one of the men who was fighting against Muhammad, his name was Naim ibn Mas'ud. I'll give you the English kind of rendering. Naim ibn Mas'ud, all right? He went to the Muslim camp. He defected, unbeknownst to his fellow tribesmen. They're all pagans. He went to the Muslim camp, and he converted to Islam for whatever reason, okay? And when Muhammad discovered that his fellow tribesmen, Muhammad's enemies, were still unaware that he had left and become a Muslim, he counseled him. He told Mas'ud go back and try to get your fellow countrymen, your fellow tribesmen to lift the siege, because actually the Muslims were losing the Battle of the Trench. They were outnumbered. Okay. So, and it was then that Muhammad looked at Ibn Mas'ud and memorably declared, "For war is deceit." Okay. So Mas'ud went back to the factions, the Al-Ahzab, and without their knowing what he had done, they didn't even know he left. He just came back. They think he's one of them. And he intentionally began to give his former kin and allies bad advice. And he went to great lengths to instigate quarrels between them. And to the point they started distrusting each other. Remember, these are different tribes. And he just instigated problems that they eventually just disbanded and lifted the siege from the Muslims and Muhammad. And therefore, they saved Islam in a very embryonic period of its stage. Okay. And this is why Ibn Mas'ud is a great hero in Muslim lore, because so here's a classic example. Here is where we get the term or the phrase "war is deceit," the axiom. And here is a perfect example, okay, where this man went and they thought, the tribesmen, they thought he's still one of them, an enemy of Muhammad. And all he did is lie and give them bad advice and sow discord. And in the end, they all left, and much to their destruction later on. Okay. So, but now the really compelling example for me, which I use often, which really justifies all this, is the story of Ka'b ibn Ashraf, a Jew. Of course, there were a lot of Jews back at that time. Some were allied with Muhammad initially, and then they had a falling out, and Muhammad had many of them, hundreds of them, I think 600, 700. The Beni Quraysh beheaded in one instance, for example. At any rate, Ka'b ibn Ashraf was a Jew, very elderly, and he was something of a poet. And he didn't like Muhammad, and he would make a lot of offensive verse about the Prophet. And it really upset Muhammad, to the point that one day he just exclaimed, "Who will kill this man who has hurt Allah and his Prophet?" Okay. Muhammad couldn't take it anymore. So a young Muslim man, new convert, another one, named Muhammad ibn Maslama, volunteered. He said, I will kill this man who hurt Allah and his Prophet. However, in order to do that, I need to lie to him and deceive him. Okay. Muhammad gave him the green light. Do it, he said. So Muhammad ibn Maslama, this young man, went to Ka'b, and Ka'b initially saw him and didn't want anything to do with him, because he's like, I know you're a follower of the Muhammad guy. But Ka'b ibn Maslama basically said, no, I'm not. I've left him. I've seen through him. He's a liar. I'm sick of him. And initially, Ka'b was still wary, but apparently, the days went by, and the disaffection of Ibn Maslama became very convincing, to the point that Ka'b took him into his confidences, and they became something of friends. And this went on for days, maybe weeks, until at one point, Ibn Maslama came with another one of his friends, another Muslim. Okay. But of course, the Jewish poet Ka'b didn't know he was a Muslim. And he also was pretending they don't like Muhammad, et cetera, et cetera. And then once Ka'b's guard was down, the Jewish poet, they both jumped on him, slaughtered him, cut his head off, brought it to Muhammad, hurled it on the ground, and everyone screamed, Allahu Akbar. Okay. So that's there's for me, one of the most classic examples of how deception, if you wish to call it Taqiyya, and like I said, a lot of scholars do, in order for the furtherance of Islamic goals, in this case, Muhammad's desire to see vengeance meted upon this man who has hurt Allah and the Prophet, is legitimate. Okay, this is the perfect example. He told him so here this young man was told, you can renounce me and curse me, maybe curse Allah, and as long as it's for a good cause, which is killing the blasphemer. Okay. And then, just for the record, Muhammad said a lot of other things that I've compiled over the years that I've been telling you. I've been writing about all this. He said, for example, quote, Allah has commanded me to equivocate among the people, just as he has commanded me to establish religious obligations. And also, quote, I have been sent with obfuscation, In other words, dissembling. Okay, Taqiyya. And quote, whoever lives his life in dissimulation dies a martyr. Dissimulation is Taqiyya, of course. So if you live your entire life, and many Muslims actually have, I've often talked about what happened in Granada, the final Islamic bastion, where, long story short, after the Reconquista and the Spaniards and the Portuguese, and they're closed in, and the Muslims have been essentially all holed up in the little tip of Granada. And then, long story short, I've written a lot about this and it's very interesting, but long story short, then the Christians, because the Muslims still would not relent, they said, okay, you either convert, become one of us, or leave, go back to North Africa, whence you came in 711 AD. This is when the Muslims conquered Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, to include Portugal. Now, which didn't exist, of course, in 711. Anyway, so they got fatwas all about Taqiyya. And the fatwas said, okay, you can just stay there. You can convert to Christianity. You can get baptized. You can go to church. You can partake of communion. No problem, the fatwa said. And lo and behold, something like 500,000 Muslims, because like I said, they were all there, concentrated in Granada, converted overnight. And what's funny is you can look at records from the people, Spaniards, talking about how these people were, it wasn't just one guy for 10 years. He would be a Christian and his kids would be Christians and their kids would be Christians and their kids would be Christians, third, fourth, fifth generation. And they would appear model Christians. And in the end, they were Muslim at heart and working to destroy Spain and hating Christianity. Okay, I have a very telling quote. It's in, I think, Sword and Scimitar, maybe chapter 6. And you can see it where this Spaniard, it's like from the 16th century. He's just shocked. And he said they lived more pious Christian lives than we did. And then we find out that they are hardcore, essentially jihadists. So that just came to mind when I read this quote where Muhammad said, quote, whoever lives his life in dissimulation dies a martyr. Okay. It's pretty deep, this sort of thing. All right. And a lot of it, again, if you want to understand how it gets rationalized and understood, there's an Arabic word which means it's niyya. Niyya means your intention. And it's so pivotal in Islam because, as draconian as we like to think Islamic law is, and it is, but there's something called niyya, intention. So why you do something, your intention goes a long way in exonerating what you do. So if my intention, if I engage in every kind of whatever sin that is officially seen as a sin, keep in mind, in Islam, lying is a sin. You're not supposed to lie, all right? So this is a perfect example, but we see all the caveats, right? And what I'm talking about now, and of course, the big caveat is the infidel is the enemy, and we're fighting him constantly. And I'll give you more details about this. Therefore, I can always lie to him because he's the enemy. So why wouldn't I be? Anyway, so that's the idea of niyya is very important and to keep in mind. Now, here's a quick little aside, which I've always found interesting. And when we talk about this Taqiyya business, what's interesting is that the entire Quran, the Revelation, as it's called, if you don't know the Quran amongst Muslims, they believe that it was revealed in piecemeal. Okay, all the ayahs and the surahs, and they were later collated, from the longest to the shortest, not chronologically. But the idea is they were revealed in piecemeal over what? I think the first revelations start 610. Muhammad dies in 632, so 22 years. Okay, and as is well known, if you look at the early revelations when Muhammad was in Mecca and was weak and outnumbered and couldn't do much of anything, couldn't really go on the offensive, you get a lot of peaceful verses. Okay, and these are the ones that the apologists are fond of quoting nowadays and telling you, what are you talking about? Islam says, you have your religion, I have my religion. There's no compulsion in religion, and other verses. Okay. But then as time goes by and Muhammad becomes stronger, well, all of a sudden Allah starts giving him different revelations, which also become stronger. So then all of a sudden, the early verses, when Muslims were completely weak, they were actually told not to fight back or even to resist. They were kind of martyrs. I mean, I don't think any of them really got killed, of course, because when push came to shove, they weren't Muslims, but they were also not offensive to the point that anyone wanted to kill them. They were seen as a nuisance. Muhammad was seen as a nuisance. But as he became stronger, then the second phase is, and there's in the Quran, you can even see these in the actual Quranic verses. The second phase is now you can fight back, but still don't start aggression. And then he goes to Medina and becomes stronger, becomes a warlord. And it's at that point you get the final word, which is, okay, now you can go on the offensive, even if they don't start the hostilities because you're strong enough. So it's sort of remarkable. But basically what we're seeing here is that the Quran itself, its actual revelation and sequence is a testimony to Taqiyya. Isn't it? And this is really not surprising when one considers that Allah himself, God, is actually described, I think, at least 3 times. I know one of the verses is, you can look up 354, Surah 3, Ayah 54, and I think maybe 830. But God is described, and it's good to call him God, so you understand how Muslims see the supreme being, Allah. He's described as the greatest makkar. You know what a makkar is? It's kind of like it's a deceiver, a trickster, someone who, or one of the best words is a schemer, someone who schemes and plots, almost like a Loki figure. All right, God in the Muslim God is described as that, and that's a compliment to him, supposedly. Okay, so it's not shocking to find that Taqiyya is so integral to Islam. It was so innate to Muhammad. And even in the actual revelation of the Quran itself, we see Taqiyya. All right. But anyway, all of this we can see is what I'm talking about. For those who don't know, it's called al-nasikh wal-mansukh. Okay, this is the idea of the verses that are abrogated, and the abrogated and the abrogator, like which verse abrogates another. And so the idea is the later verse, because it comes out later, abrogates the earlier verse. And as we just saw, the later verses are the violent ones. So the very, very final verses in Muhammad's life are the most violent. For example, 9:5, which is known as the sword verse, which basically, to paraphrase it, is when the forbidden months are over, lay in wait and ambush for the polytheist, the infidel. Lay in wait, ambush, kill them, take them captive, do whatever to them. Okay, it's known as the sword verse, and that verse alone is believed to have abrogated, I forget, something like 100 verses, more peaceful verses. And also with it, also 9, Surah 9, Surah al-Tawbah, 9:29 says, fight the people of the book who were told or somehow have a privileged status with Muslims. People of the book would be Christians and Jews, people who have scriptures. Fight them until they pay tribute and know their place and live in subjection, or you kill them. That's the 3 choices given to a Jew or a Christian, right? You convert, or we fight to the death, or you accept your place in society as a second-class dhimmi. Not the most enviable lot, obviously. So let's see here. This is you should check out my Substack. Think about subscribing, because I plan on putting what I'm telling you today into a long article or essay with the sources, if you want the sources, if you don't trust me, right? So now we come to it. So the fact that Islam legitimizes deception during war, of course, is not that shocking, right? Like I mentioned, this is very normal. I mean, who doesn't engage in deception? All's fair in love and war. Isn't that the saying by some Elizabethan writer, I believe? John something. And all sorts of non-Muslim Western philosophers, Eastern philosophers, Sun Tzu, Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, they all justified, of course, deception during war. Now, the crucial difference between Islam is that war is a perpetual affair with the infidel. So if I'm always at war with the infidel and deception is okay when I'm at war, what does that mean? Then deception is okay at all times against the infidel. So that's the little trick. Now here's a quote I like, and this is again when I was at the Library of Congress. We had the old edition of the Encyclopedia of Islam, which was actually pretty good. It was objective and scholarly and didn't engage in political correctness the way the new version of the Encyclopedia of Islam does. And I'm not sure what the year is, but it was the entry for jihad written by Emil Tyan. He writes the following quote: "The duty of the jihad exists as long as the universal domination of Islam has not been attained." Okay, look at that. The duty of jihad doesn't end. It exists as long as the universal domination of Islam has not been attained. In other words, jihad goes on until the whole world is conquered. He continues, "Peace with non-Muslim nations is therefore a provisional state of affairs only. The chance of circumstance alone can justify it temporarily." Okay, so the Islamic worldview is to conquer the world. And that's altruistic, of course, from their mentality, right? And we're bringing the light of Islam to the world, and Islam is not out to be partners or coexist with anyone else, any other belief system. It's out to take over and guide humanity into the right path. Okay. And as such, only when Muslims are weak and they need a reprieve because there's nothing they can do, can they make treaties and truces. Okay. And it's supposed to be 10 years only. And then you're supposed to reassess after 10 years. Now, if you're perpetually weaker, as in the modern era, obviously it keeps renewing. And I'm not saying that they meet every 10 years, but it's just understood that, okay, we're weak and there's nothing we can do about it. So we're not going to go on the jihad. Excuse me. But as you saw, according to that quote from the prestigious Encyclopedia of Islam, when it was prestigious and when it was authoritative, makes it clear that war is a non-stop affair. Okay. And so if that's the case, then like I said, and deception is okay in war because war is deceit and the infidel were always at war. And to remind you, of course, the idea, the classical understanding is that, there's two dars, two abodes, Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam, as it's called, or the house of Islam, which signifies the Islamic world, wherever Sharia is in charge. That's how they understand it. That's the whole idea, by the way. You hear about Sharia in the news. It's interesting, isn't it? And the idea for Muslims is as long as Sharia is in charge, then you don't have to be a Muslim. You can be, like we said, and you can be a Christian or a Jew, pay tribute, just know your place. And as long as, so the goal is not to convert the world to Islam. That's not true. The goal is that Sharia, meaning Islam, okay, as I've explained before, the two are really synonymous, Sharia and Islam. So as the goal is Islam has to be in charge of the world, okay, and dominate it. That's it. Whether you want to stay as an infidel and pay tribute, that's your affair. So the abode of Islam and the abode of war, abode of Islam is the Islamic world. Abode of war is the land where the non-Muslim lives, okay, and it's called the abode of war because that's where you go and wage war until it gets subsumed into the abode of Islam and it's governed by Sharia. Okay, so that is the classic idea that's never changed. That's still the codified worldview of Islam, what I just described, this constant warfare, which the hostility is there, okay, and the deception is there because war is deceit, but we're not necessarily going to fight you because you're stronger than us, okay? So as that quote said, circumstance is such that it'd be futile for the Muslim world to declare war on the world right now, seeing how weak it is realistically. People forget how really weak the Muslim world is because they see Muslims terrorizing Westerners all the time. It has nothing to do with Muslim strength. It has to do with Western, I don't know, complicity, stupidity. I think stupidity is giving them a break when we say that. But be that as it may, let me continue. So here's a nice quote from the Muslim historian and anthropologist Ibn Khaldun. I actually like reading his stuff. He died around 1406. And here's a quote where he clearly articulates this division that I'm telling you. He writes, quote, "In the Muslim community, Jihad is in the Muslim ummah, in other words, jihad is a religious duty because of the universalism of the Muslim mission and the obligation to convert everybody to Islam, either by persuasion or by force. The other religious groups did not have a universal mission, and the jihad was not a religious duty for them, save only for purposes of defense. But Islam is under obligation to gain power over other nations. Okay. Now I know he said the Muslim mission and obligation to convert everybody to Islam, either by persuasion or by force, may seem to contradict what I said. But later on, he also makes clear that the people of the book can pay tribute and pay jizya and still not convert. Okay. But you have to also understand the idea of jizya is to make them convert. There's a reason. The logic of Islam is this. Okay, you as a Jew or a Christian, fine, we'll take money and enjoy the money and we'll push you around and you can be a second-class citizen. And we know in doing that, you're not going to like it. Okay. So eventually you or your progeny are probably going to convert and come around and see the light. Okay. So that is also why he phrased it that way, because the mission is to get everyone to convert. But it's sufficient to at least make sure that Sharia governs, and you can live, if you can tolerate it, you can live as a dhimmi, okay, which not many people could tolerate. That's why the Muslim world, which used to be, most of it, at least MENA, Middle East, North Africa, which used to be the Christian world, is no longer. It's primarily Muslim, overwhelmingly. Why? Because it wasn't easy to be a dhimmi and constantly pay money you didn't have, and then afterwards be mistreated socially and oppressed. So that's a lot of people saw the light of Islam and converted over the centuries. Okay. We already spoke a little bit about treaties, and that's very important. And we spoke a little bit about the Niyya. Now, let me give you some more quotes that I just came across about. And so Niyya is the intention, which I told you is very pivotal. And here is, for example, how the Hanafis, one of the four Muslim schools of law or jurisprudence, they assert that Muslims may abrogate treaties merely if it seems advantageous for Islam. Okay. And it's why it's reminiscent of this hadith, canonical hadith. Muhammad said, quote, "If you ever take an oath to do something and later on you find that something else is better, then you should expiate your oath and do what is better." Okay. And what is better, having what I just discussed, what is better than actually making Allah's word supreme, making Sharia law govern the lands? So you see, just that verse right there, or it's not a verse, it's a hadith, where Muhammad says, if you ever take an oath to do something, and then later on you find that something else is better, then expiate your oath and do what is better. Okay, so if I make an oath with you, I'm a Muslim, and I say, all right, 10 years of peace, because I'm weak, and then 3 years into it, I get strong, and but we have an oath. Well, I can break the oath because it's better for me to exercise my newfound strength on behalf of Islam. Infidel, you see? Now, let's go back to the hostility, what I told you earlier, hostility disguised as grievances, okay? And, the business about Osama bin Laden and what he would say. And this actually is a good way to segue into some of the other forms of deception. Like I said, most people are familiar with the word Taqiyya, and they use it as sort of an umbrella category, which I think is legitimate because that's what the scholars do. They use it, like we said, as a form of active deceit, not just to self-preservation, because I feel like I'm going to get killed if someone knows I'm a Muslim and I have to preserve it, okay? So, for example, there's something called Tawriya, and I'll give you a little more details, but since we were talking about grievances and Osama bin Laden, he would, for example, initiate messages. He would write, and I wrote about this a long time ago, he would write to the West things like, quote, "Reciprocal treatment is part of justice," or "Peace to whoever follows guidance." I've talked a lot about this phrase, "Peace to whoever follows guidance." Now, when you hear that, it sounds nice, right? And he actually, in many of his letters, that's almost every letter Osama bin Laden or communique, he would start it off by saying, "Peace to whoever follows guidance." And it sounds like I'm giving you advice, right, infidel? Take the advice so we can come to peace and live in harmony. Now, what's interesting is, well, what is the guidance? And so this is now a form of Tawriya. Tawriya, I'll give you a little more details, but it's a kind of lying where the words fit the meaning, even though I mean something different. Okay. So what he's saying is, guidance. Western ears are going to hear that like, oh, he's talking about some kind of justice or peace or whatever. Actually, the guidance is you come to Islam and convert. That's how it's understood. Okay, but you don't know that. So that there's another form of a deception. But anyway, um, earlier I mentioned to you how Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. The reason I wanted to write the Al Qaeda reader, and I did, and I translated it, is because they were saying the grievance mantra. Okay, we're doing this to you because of what you did to us. Now I'm going to give you a choice quote, an excerpt, from one of Osama's letters to fellow Muslims in Arabic, to give you an idea. Now this is going to sound just like ISIS, I think. Okay, so keep in mind the Osama bin Laden, and I understand one of his letters. It's so funny because I remember going through all these letters and translating them in 2005 and 6, and they came out in my book Al Qaeda Reader 2008. And I think it was like 5 years ago or 4 where Gen Z finally came across that same letter where he was talking about grievances, and they were just amazed, like, wow, you see? Oh man, they were just angry because of what the West is doing. All right. So I had to resuscitate some of my older writings and basically recycle them because they didn't need any changing. Kind of like, okay, no, you're an idiot. That's not what they mean, and here's the truth. But now, so here's a full quote. This was originally Arabic. I translated it. This is Osama bin Laden talking to fellow Muslims. And he said this after what he tells the West about, it's all about reciprocal treatment. You started the feud, come to guidance and we'll all get along. He wrote this to fellow Muslims. When a group of Muslims, it was a bunch of Saudis, he's Saudi, and a bunch of Saudis wrote a letter to a bunch of Americans, and it sounded extra peaceful or something. You can read the whole thing in the Al Qaeda Reader, the context, including the portions of these letters. But to chastise them, he wrote, quote, as to the relationship between Muslims and infidels, because they were making it sound like, Muslims and infidels can live in peace, which is what he says when talking to Americans and Europeans. But now he's talking to fellow Muslims. So he's kind of like, you guys are drinking our own Kool-Aid, wake up. So he says, as to the relationship between Muslims and infidels, this is summarized by the Most High's word, by Allah's word in the Quran, which is, quote, we, Muslims, renounce you, non-Muslims. Enmity and hatred shall forever reign between us till you believe in Allah alone. That's Quran 64. And then bin Laden continues. So there is an enmity evidenced by fierce hostility from the heart. And this fierce hostility, that is battle, ceases only if the infidel submits to the authority of Islam, or if his blood is forbidden from being shed, for example, a dhimmi who's paying tribute and living as a second-class citizen, or if Muslims are at that point in time weak and incapable of war. But if the hate at any time extinguishes from the heart, this is great apostasy. You've apostatized, you've left Islam if the hatred goes away. And then he continues, such then is the basis and true foundation of the relationship between the infidel and the Muslim, between the non-Muslim and the Muslim. Battle, animosity, and hatred directed from the Muslim to the infidel is the foundation of our religion. And we consider that a justice and a kindness to them because this is altruism. It's tough love. Right? We hate you and we're trying to kill you because we want to bring you to the light of Islam. Okay? So this is, like I said, this sounds like ISIS, okay? Well, it's not ISIS, it's not Al-Qaeda, this is Al-Qaeda, but this is Islam, this is the Quran. They're quoting the Quran, right? You've heard me quote this verse many times, Quran 64, which calls on Muslims to hate non-Muslims, and to the point that I always mention this video, it's on my YouTube channel, it's probably the oldest thing you'll find there from like over a decade ago, and it's an Egyptian cleric, Muslim, talking about how Yeah, you can marry women who are not Muslims, Christians and Jews, Ahl Kitab, people of the book, but you have to hate them and show them that you hate them. And he quotes this verse. Okay. So anyway, the point here is I just wanted to show you again, because we started it off talking about Al Qaeda. I wanted to show you evidence of the Taqiyya that even Al Qaeda was engaged in, which a lot of people, like I told you, up until recently, sort of sympathized with and said, "Oh, look, he actually wrote a letter about how it was the U.S.'s fault and he was upset." Well, yeah, well, that's not what he was saying to Muslims. All right, let's start wrapping this up. So basically, as you can see, Taqiyya really presents a range of ethical dilemmas if you really think about it. You know, if someone really in their heart is born and bred into believing that God is okay with lying, okay, all the time, and you know that the ends justify the means, the niyya, the intention. It's all about gaining power, and you can do whatever you want. Okay, lie, cheat, and steal because it's all good in the end. You know, because it's got a good motive in the end. It's all about empowering Islam. You can imagine what that does to a person's mentality and worldview when they're dealing with the non-Muslims. And I've seen this, and I've read a lot about in the modern era Muslims who are then called terrorists, and then you find out they've lived lives just like I was giving you the example of Grenada and the Muslims back then in the 15th, 16th century, and how they really internalized and managed to live basically double lives. And you see this actually often in modern day terrorists, where they're just so duplicitous, nobody can tell, okay, what's going on with them and who they really are, right? But most Westerners, and that's why we're having this live stream, that's why we're talking about this, that's why I always thought this particular Taqiyya business was of great interest for me, is because most Westerners just simply don't get it, and they continue projecting their worldview and their mentality, which is quite often, like I said, when it thinks about things like, even though most Westerners, of course, won't do this, but the idea is like when someone threatens me and my religion, I'll die for my religion. Okay, and they seem to think that Muslims are of the same mentality, and no, they're not. In fact, amongst some of the Islamic clerics, not only do they permit Taqiyya, they actually say you have to do it because there's Quranic verses that talk about you as a Muslim cannot willingly destroy yourself, kill yourself. And so if you are actually being threatened to renounce Islam or die, according to them, the Quran says you have to fake it and say fake your Islam, that you're renouncing Islam, because the Quran says you can't kill yourself. What a convenient little excuse that is, huh? All right. So to summarize the main points, and then we're going to look at a couple other doctrines and interesting anecdotes. But so to understand and summarize the main points, the first one is this, and here's the dilemma that we're really dealing with. The first point is that, as I mentioned, Islamic law, Sharia, unambiguously splits the world into two perpetually warring halves: the Islamic world, Dar al-Islam, and the non-Islamic world, Dar al-Harb. Okay, and they are, and this is to go on forever until the former, the Muslims, conquer and subsume the latter. Yes, there can be treaties when Muslims are weak and so forth, but that's the goal. That's the idea. Okay. Now, if war with the infidel is a perpetual affair, and it is, and if war is deceit, because that's what Muhammad said, and it is, and if deeds are justified by intentions, and they are, then any number of Muslims will obviously conclude that they have a blank check to lie to non-Muslims, in as much as they can rationalize that the lie is somehow benefiting them and or Islam. And to benefit a Muslim is benefiting Islam, of course, because if a Muslim gets empowered, well, that's theoretically, of course, very good for Islam. Okay, so I think that is the entire issue. Okay, and like I said, it's seen as it's the ends justify the means, and the end is seen as a good, noble, holy thing. okay, empowering Islam or empowering Muslims over non-Muslims. Okay, who can argue with that if you're a Muslim? So you can, like I said, lie, cheat, and steal, because the niyyah, the intention, and in Muhammad's words, war is deceit and war is a non-stop affair. Okay. Yeah, and that's not even, I already gave you all the verses and the Quran verses about Taqiyya and so forth, but I'm giving you the way I see it, kind of like the simple way to understand it, which is we don't have to get bogged down with the word Taqiyya. And I actually think that's unfortunate when people really get caught up in that word, because I told you there's ways around it where Muslims can say, well, hey, you're wrong. Taqiyya is just about self-preservation. Okay, if you dig deep inside, you will find it's not. But that's how it's taught, especially in Western schools. Okay, I mean, Western schools are still teaching that Taqiyya is a Shia thing. Okay, but what I'm saying is, if you really break it down, okay, very simply, okay, Islam is at war with the world and jihad until it subsumes and conquers it one way or the other. True. Islam is war is deceit. Okay, well, if war is perpetual and never ends, and we have artificial treaties because Muslims are weak, and war is deceit, well, then the Muslim is constantly given free reign, free license, to lie and deceive the infidel. All right. So that's one of the easy ways that I see it. Now, before moving on from Taqiyya, I wanted to give you a fun anecdote that I came across when I was writing the Two Swords of Christ, about the Templars and the Hospitallers. And I believe I'm the only one who's ever seen and kind of come up with what I'm going to tell you, my theory, which I lay it out in the book, and it deals with Taqiyya and Templars. And I have a few chapters here. In fact, because my memory is not what it was, I have to pull it up so I can read some of it to you. But yeah, it's basically chapters 11 and 12, right? And so here's very, very interesting anecdote, and it just I think it's great. I should actually I'll probably write a whole article about it. But so the assassins, ever hear of them? Okay, the first, that's where we get the word assassin and assassinate. It is, shocker, goes back to a Muslim group who were known as the Hashashin. So Hashashin came into English or Western European languages as assassin. Okay, so Hashashin, assassin, means someone who is sent on a mission to kill someone. Okay, it started with a Muslim group, the Hashashin, and they too were Shias, actually. And so basically, the story that's very interesting is that these Hashashin really were very prominent during the Crusader era, at least for a while in the early 11th century, or actually late 11th century, and all throughout the 12th and 13th century, until the Mongols, I think, decimated them the way they did almost everyone else. So these assassins lived in the mountainous crags all around Syria and Iraq and Turkey, and they were their own sect, and they were Shias, so they weren't very friendly with Sunnis or Christians. Okay, but of course, and this is where you get our first and earliest and best example writing about them comes from Marco Polo, right? The Italian merchant who traveled into those lands, and he actually encountered them and learned about them. And he's the one who tells us that what they would do is his name was Sheikh al-Jabal, right? Or the old man in the mountain is how it came into the Western consciousness. The old man in the mountain, the Sheikh al-Jabal or Jabal. And he was this elder, the leader, the master of the assassin order, if you will. And what he would do is he would take young recruits and brainwash them. He would get them high on hashish, hence their name, Hashashin. Okay, he would get them high on hashish, and when they were just completely blitzed out of their mind, he would take them into a room where they would be around beautiful, scantily clad women who did whatever they did to them. Okay. And then they would wake up in their own room where they were left off. And then the head of the order, the sheikh, the old man in the mountain, would explain to them that they just had a vision of paradise as it's described in Islam and in the Quran, right? Ain al-hur, huris, the supernatural women in heaven that Muslims, especially those who die for Islam and get martyred, go and perpetually deflower, for eternity. So they would give them a taste of it. And these young men would believe that when they didn't realize they were high. They would believe that they had a vision, that this old man gave them a vision of what's waiting for them in heaven. And all they have to do is listen to the old man, who would then send them on suicide missions. Basically, they would go and assassinate whoever, and they would do the same thing, the whole Taqiyya thing. They would worm their way in and act like they're friends and be loyal to them for prolonged periods of time, and then finally try to kill them with their chosen weapon, a dagger. And then they would expect to die. In fact, the assassin would not run away. He would actually stand there and wait after he got his target to be killed, so he can go to the warm embraces of the huris that he encountered. So you talk about deception and Taqiyya, right? What the old man in the mountain was doing. Anyway, so that's the unsavory group known as the Hashishin and the assassins. Now, a very interesting anecdote occurs, and it's primarily recorded by William of Tyre, okay, the chronicler, the Archbishop of Tyre, and he's a contemporary, so he's there at this time. And basically, the story is, I'm trying to find the actual quotes to give you. I should have pulled them out, but yeah, here it is. So all of a sudden, a delegation of the assassins is sent to the king of Jerusalem at the time. Amalric, I believe, was it? Okay. And they go, this group, the assassins. So these are Shia Muslims who believe in Islam and Muhammad and the whole 9 yards. And I just told you their entire modus operandi is all about deception and whatnot. He sends a delegation to the king of Jerusalem saying, look, because at the time, the assassins, the Hashishin, are paying tribute to the Templars, the Knights of the Temple. Okay, because at one point, the assassins went and killed one too many guys, and it really rankled. They killed one man while he was praying in the church. And at that moment, a group of the Knights of the Temple went and just completely blitzed into the mountains of the assassins and raided them and put them to the sword till these ferocious, scary assassins that everyone was scared of, including Sunni Muslims, agreed to pay tribute to the Knights of the Temple. So the Sheikh, the old man of the mountain, sends this delegation to the king of Jerusalem saying, I've been reading your Bible, kind of convinced. I'm ready now to convert to Christianity. Me and all my people, all right? Just one thing, if you can do me one favor, I don't want to pay the Templars anymore, all right? So just make sure these guys are no longer, if you can help me out so I don't have to pay them tribute, we're all converting to Christianity tomorrow, okay? And so the king, he thought, hey, that'd be great to get these, the assassins who are the scourge of everyone, including Christians, as I mentioned, to get them off our back and also as allies and to save their souls. They're going to be Christians, right? So the king agreed. He said, you know what? You're not going to pay anymore. And he had no authority, actually. The Templars were not, they don't have to speak. They didn't have to answer to the king. But he basically, his logic was, even if he had to pay the ransom, he would pay it to the Templars, okay? So that was the logic. But he basically said, you're good to go. Let's do this thing. Go tell the man in the mountain, we're going to cancel the abrogation, and then you can become Christians. So here's the quote, actually. Oh, sorry. All right. Here's a quote from William of Tyre. He's talking now about the old man in the mountain. So he says, quote, contrary to the habits of his ancestors, this man possessed the books of the evangelists and the apostolic law. He means the Bible, And over these he poured continually. He's talking about the sheikh, the old man in the mountain, the head of the assassins. So over the Bible he poured continually, and for some time had with much labor tried to follow the marvelous precepts of Christ and also the apostolic doctrine, the gentle and noble doctrine of Christ and his followers, when compared with that which the miserable seducer Muhammad had transmitted to his accomplices and deluded followers, caused him to despise the beliefs which he had absorbed with his mother's milk and to abominate the unclean tenets of that deceiver. So, inasmuch as he read the Bible, he started realizing, you know what, all that stuff I heard and learned about Muhammad, it's not true. And he grew to despise it. Continues William of Tyre. He instructed his people also in the same way and made them cease observing the superstition of the prophet. He tore down the places of prayer which they had been accustomed to use, absolved them from fasting, and permitted the use of wine and pork. At length, desirous of advancing into a fuller understanding of the mysteries of God's law, he sent an envoy to the king, which is what I told you. Okay. And he sent that envoy, and the king was very impressed, and he said, "Yep, sure, we'll make sure, and we'll pay you, and we'll pay the ransom. We'll either get the Templars to pay we'll either pay them the ransom, or I'll make sure they don't." So anyway, so he went. So now here's where it gets pretty interesting. The envoys, the assassin envoys, after meeting with the king and being given this good news, are on their way back to tell the old man in the mountain, when lo and behold, a one-eyed Templar, his name is Walter of something, comes out of nowhere and kills them all. All right. And now William of Tyre and the king, and the way it's presented is, once again, these Templars are loose cannons. Either that, okay, they're either loose cannons, or this was done because he wouldn't hear about the idea that we're going to stop getting money from the assassins, and he doesn't care about their souls. He'd rather, they'd rather, the temple, the order wants money more than anything else. Muslims can go to hell. Who cares? Or another theory is that, the Templars existed to justify their existence. They wanted to make sure there was always perpetual war between Muslims and Christians. So they could not tolerate the notion that, there could be peace between Muslims and Christians. Now, all of these ideas that I just told you is exactly how that attack by the Templar knight, the one-eyed knight who killed the envoys, that's how it was explained by William of Tyre and so many other people, chroniclers of the time. Okay, and that's what gave rise, if you're familiar with the Knights of the Temple and how they were kind of demonized, including in their time, this is one of the main episodes that they were convinced either they're just too greedy, all they want is money from the assassins in this case, and they don't care about what's good for Christendom or what's good for Muslim souls, all right? Or two, they just want to make sure there's perpetual warfare, so their order can continue being funded and have people donate to it, okay? Now, and the king just was irate, and he barged into the temple, the master, the Templar master's headquarters, and demanded the head of Walter, the one-eyed knight, not necessarily to kill him, but he wanted to, throw him in prison. And the master, Otto, wouldn't relent. Actually, good for him. But then eventually the king got him, and he threw him in a dungeon for a long time. Okay, and then eventually it's interesting because then he basically released him. All right, now. And he didn't, and he apologized to the assassin and the master. Now, all right, what really happened? Do you honestly believe that? And I read to you the quote from from William of Tyre. Okay, and the way he was talking. Do you honestly believe that the head of that order of the assassins? Now that I've told you about Islam and Taqiyya, and especially Shiaism, where I told you it's integral, do you really think that head of that man of the assassin, the sheikh, the old man, read the Bible and was just ready to convert? And the way William presented it. And if so, would he really, if the Bible weighed so heavily on him, if he was so convinced of its truths, would he really have just reneged on the whole idea just because his envoys were killed. I mean, it's a tragedy, and the king did throw the guilty party in prison, and officially punished him in that sense. Is that enough to just say, okay, I'm out of it? Well, that's how it was presented. Okay, so what really happens in this episode? Now, everyone will tell you what I just told you, which is, well, the most charitable, interpretation is just that the Knights of the Temple were just loose cannons. Okay, that's the most charitable I've ever seen. But now here's a few interesting points, and I get into it in the book, and I give you the sources. But the Knights of the Temple and the Hospitallers also later on were basically not just military warriors. They actually were seen as they were an intelligence unit. Okay, and a lot of them spoke Arabic. They studied Islam. They understood the machinations of Islam. And so I wonder, in that context, did that knight, what he do? Did he do it because he just in no way, shape, or form believed what was happening, and he wanted to dip it in the bud and just spoil it, kill this guy, and make sure that talks between the assassin and the king fall apart because they're going to bear ill fruit, because the king's going to believe they all became Christians when they're really not. All right. That's actually my theory. That's what I think really happened. But I've never read that, because most people and Crusades historians are not familiar with the doctrine of Taqiyya, especially how integral it is to Shias, especially to the assassin group who perform Taqiyya on their own members, as we just saw. So anyway, I thought that's a very interesting anecdote, I thought. And it just, again, shows you how these sorts of things have always been around. And even until now, here's a perfect historical anecdote. Most people don't understand its significance. Like I told you, your average historian, Crusades historian, will just take the normal William of Tyre kind of interpretation. Yeah, these guys were just lunatics, even though they know that the Knights of the Temple were also an intelligence unit who really would study and know the languages of Islam and so forth. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the doctrine of Tawriya, another one of the famous lying doctrines, which I've already mentioned to you a little bit, where I talked about Muhammad, how he equivocates and whatnot. Now, the word Tawriya, here's how the authoritative Hans Wehr Arabic English Dictionary defines it. It says Tawriya is, quote, hiding, concealment, dissemblance, dissimulation, hypocrisy, equivocation, ambiguity, illusion. All right. And its trilateral roots are double waraya. Okay, and just like waka, you get Taqiyya. So wara, you get Tawriya. And it appears in the context in the Quran. At least the root, and you can see Quran 531 and 726. Now, this one is a fun one. Yeah, I mean, I know it's not fun, but it's kind of amusing. It just shows you the license that Muslims, feel they have when it comes to lying. So the classic definition, which I give often about Tawriya and how this form of lying works, is like this: as long as the word, what I say, what comes out of my mouth, as long as it fits the meaning, even though I mean something else, then it's not a lie. Okay. So the classic example is someone asks me, hey, can I borrow $20? And I say, I don't have a penny in my pocket. Now, any normal person will assume by I don't have a penny in my pocket is my way of saying I don't have any money. But I might have a $20 bill in my pocket. I just literally don't have a penny in my pocket. That I know. So I did not lie. Think about that. Okay. So according to Islamic teaching, I didn't lie, because I just said the truth. I said, I don't have a penny in my pocket. I didn't lie to you. It's not my problem that you took it to mean that I don't have any money. All right. Now I'm going to give you a lot. There's so many examples from, past and present sheikhs, including very authoritative ones. So here's Sheikh Muhammad Salah al-Munajid. This is a modern cleric. And I actually translated what he wrote many years back, what he said, actually. I think it was a video. I have a link here. He wrote, quote, or said, Tawriya is permissible under two conditions. One, that the words used fit the hidden meaning, like I just said. Two, that it does not lead to an injustice. Now, injustice as defined by Sharia, as we just saw, of course, not by Western standards. So, as we just saw, it's not an injustice to subjugate an infidel in this sense. All right. But then it's permissible for a Muslim to even swear when he's doing Tawriya. All right. So Munajid, for example, he gave an example of a man who swore to Allah, I can only sleep under a roof. And then he was caught sleeping atop his roof out under the sky. And he exonerated himself. And he said, by roof, I mean the open sky. And then Munajid said, well, yes, this is legitimate. After all, Quran 21:32 refers to the sky as a roof. So the man didn't lie after he was caught. Okay. Now, another famous one that I see often, and I have clerics on record who say this. They say when you meet during Christmas, if you're in the West, and you meet Christians and, well, you know, Christians are celebrating Christmas, you can actually say to them, I wish you the best. That's nice. All right. But then he clarifies, he tells you, but by saying, I wish you the best, you mean in your mind, the best is that you become a Muslim. Okay. So I really wish the best for you. All right. Of course, the goofy Christian's going to think, oh, he's celebrating Christmas with me. Oh, he's a moderate. But, so there it is. That's what it means. Now, so as usual, Tawriya goes back to Muhammad, the perfect example for all mankind. As I said earlier, okay, here's another Sheikh Uthman al-Khamis. He says that Muhammad often used Tawriya, okay? And as I already quoted you, because Muhammad is recorded saying, and Uthman al-Khamis mentions these hadith, which I already mentioned, where Muhammad says, quote, Allah has commanded me to equivocate among the people, inasmuch as he has commanded me to establish religious obligations. And I also told you that Muhammad said, quote, I have been sent with obfuscation, and whoever lives his life in dissimulation or taqiyya dies a martyr, right? And all these, by the way, I had translated from Sami Mukarram's book, Taqiyya fil Islam. Like I told you, it's a treasure trove of information on this, a little known doctrine, and on deception in general, okay? Now, here's a good one. And this is from the book. Brace yourself. In a canonical hadith, Muhammad said, if any of you ever pass gas or soil yourself during prayers, okay, and therefore you break wudu, you should hold your nose and leave. Now, and this is in Sunan Abu Dawood. So what does that mean? Well, as the clerics explain it, holding one's nose and leaving implies smelling something offensive, which is true. Though most people will think it was someone else who committed the stench and the offense. Okay, so this is to save face and you're embarrassed, right? You flatulated or whatever you did, or however they, while you're bending and prostrating. And you need to go and clean yourself. So just hold your nose. You can save face. I didn't do it. It's someone else. And leave. Okay. And no one, you're holding your nose because it stinks, but you didn't say it was someone else. But that's how people will register it. There's your prophet. Now, here is Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, founder of one of Islam's 4 schools of jurisprudence, madhahibs. The primary one that's actually practiced in Saudi Arabia. Once when he was conducting class, someone came knocking. And this person that was knocking was asking for one of his students. So this great Imam, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, from behind the door said, he's not here. What would he be doing here? And the man left. All the time, Ibn Hanbal was holding his hand and pointing at it and saying, he's not here. What would he be doing here? So that's not a lie, you see, because he was saying he's not in my hand. Well, it's not his fault. The guy can't see it, but his words fit the meaning. He's not here. What would he be doing here? So the man left. This is the founder of one of the main schools of Islamic law. That's how well respected he is. All right. Now, also, Sufyan al-Thawri, with another important early Islamic thinker, um, he was once brought before Caliph Mahdi, and the Caliph refused to let him leave, all right, for whatever reason, until Thawri, Sufyan al-Thawri, swore he would return, okay, swore by Allah. And then the Caliph said, fine, you can go. So as he left, Thawri, he just clandestinely left his sandals by the door, and then he left. And then 5-10 minutes later, he came back, collected his sandals, and left for good. You see, he didn't lie. He said, I'll be back. And he came back to get his sandals, and then he left. And that's not a lie. That's actually promoted in Islam because it's so clever. And I know this is starting to sound like stuff coming out of, 1001 Arabian Nights, but let me give you some more modern Muslim authorities. Okay, so here's Sheikh Muhammad Hassan, the famous cleric who says Islam forbids Muslims from smiling to infidels except when advantageous, and he did say that. And Abdullah al-Shakir, who justified it. They both give this example of someone knocking on your door and you don't want to see them. So a relative answers the door saying, he's not here. But by here, they mean the immediate room, which is true, since you will be hiding in another room. So he didn't lie, your relative, okay? Because here, he means here, and you're in another room, right? Likewise, on the popular website, which I used to frequent a lot, Islam Web, okay, where Muslims ask questions and basically get a fatwa, get an answer. A girl, I read about it, posed her moral dilemma, which was that her father has continuously told her that whenever the phone rings, she's to answer saying, he's not here, her father, okay? And then the fatwa online solves her problem. It says, you're free to lie, but when you say he's not here, you must mean he's not in the same room or directly in front of you, okay? And here's the thing, a lot of this may be amusing and funny, and a lot of people may say, okay, these are just justifying white lies. But if we go back, here's another quote from Sheikh al-Munajid. He says, Tawriya is permissible if it is necessary or serves a Sharia interest. Okay, so we go back to the original formulation. Islam's at war with the infidel. This war is deceit. And what's a Sharia interest? Well, empowering Sharia over the non-Muslim. Therefore, Tawriya is completely acceptable, and Muslims, again, have a blank check to lie. Okay? All right. I think I should start wrapping it up. But you know what? I did print out some things that I wrote many, many years ago for an older article. And it's basically mostly Christians who were living in Syria and Iraq around the time that ISIS was taken over, 2013, 14, 15, okay? And they talked about how we lived in the same village with Muslims, and we always got along, no problem. I mean, we would even help the Muslims, we would do all sorts of things, and we would treat them like family, and they would seem to reciprocate until, well, circumstances changed, didn't they? ISIS came to town. And all of a sudden, the Muslims that were like family changed. So let me read to you a few quotes. Pretty bizarre stuff, huh? It's hard to reconcile. This is a religion, right? A religion, as it's called. So one man, George, from the ancient Christian town of Malula, okay, which is, I think, the last place in the world where Christ's language is still spoken, actually, literally, Aramaic. He talked about, okay, when al-Nusra, and this is even earlier, this is, I think, in 2014, invaded, this is what he said in an interview, quote, "We knew our Muslim neighbors all our lives. Yes, we knew the Deeb family were quite radical, but we thought they would never betray us. We ate with them. We are one people. A few of the Deeb family had left months ago, and we guessed they were with the Nusra, an Al-Qaeda front. But their wives and children were still here. We looked after them. Then 2 days before Nusra attacked, the families suddenly left the town without telling us. We didn't know why. And then our neighbors led our enemies right in front of us. He explained with disbelief how he saw a young member of that deep family, whom he knew from youth, and almost, it was like a father or uncle to him, holding a sword and leading these foreign jihadists, because keep in mind, they're all Syrians, and the jihadists were from all around the world, and he was leading them straight to that man's home. And so George continues, quote, "We used to have excellent relations. It never occurred to us that Muslim neighbors would betray us. We all said, please let this town live in peace. We don't have to kill each other. But now there is bad blood. They brought in Nusra to throw out the Christians and get rid of us forever. Some of the Muslims who lived with us are good people, but I will never trust them again." Okay. Now here's another one. Here's a teenage Christian girl from Homs, Syria, which once had a Christian population of about 80,000, but last reported after what ISIS did was down to 0. Here's her story, quote, "We left because they were trying to kill us. They wanted to kill us because we were Christians. They were calling us kafirs, infidels. Even little children started saying these things. Those who were our neighbors turned against us. At the end, when we ran away, we went through the balconies. We did not even dare go out on the street in front of our house. I've kept in touch with the few Christian friends left back home, but I cannot speak to my Muslim friends anymore. I feel very sorry about it." All right. Now, here's another one. When asked who exactly threatened and drove out Christians from Mosul in Iraq, which fell to the Islamic State, when was it, 2014, 15? Another anonymous Christian refugee responded, quote, "We left Mosul because ISIS came to the city. The Sunni Muslim people of Mosul embraced ISIS and drove the Christians out of the city. When ISIS entered Mosul, the people hailed them and drove out the Christians. The people who embraced ISIS, the people who lived there with us, yes, my neighbors, our neighbors and other people, they threatened us. They said, leave before ISIS gets you." What does that mean? Where would we go? Christians have no support in Iraq. Whoever claims to be protecting Christians is a liar, okay? And there's so many other anecdotes of this, and they go back in time. You know me, I like the continuity. I like to look at the past and the present. And here's one. It's actually, I think it's recorded in in Crucified Again. And it comes from the Ottoman Empire, and it's well over 100 years old. And here's the following quote. And this was actually recorded in the book Turkey and Its People, which was published in 1911 by Sir Edwin Piers. So and it's on page 39. The quote is, "Then one night," this is a Muslim woman talking, "Then one night, my husband came home and told me that the Sultan had sent word that we were to kill all the Christians in our village and that we would have to kill our neighbors. I was very angry and told him that I did not care who gave such orders. They were wrong. These neighbors have always been kind to us. And if he dared to kill them, Allah would pay us out. I tried all I could to stop him, but he killed them all, killed them with his own hand." Okay. So you see, circumstance. It's all about circumstance and change, and when the Muslim feels in power and when the Muslim is weak. And it's sad to put it that way, but I'm reading to you testimonials from people who lived it, and it really accords with what we've been talking about, doesn't it? And all that stuff all traces back to Islamic teaching and doctrine. And one last doctrine. There's so many of them, and I don't know why they all start with T, but one is Taysir, and this is a little known one, but I've sort of touched upon it. And what it means is, and Yusuf al-Qaradawi, a very famous sheikh, Egyptian sheikh who died a few years ago, but was kind of recognized as the most important sheikh of the century, he would advocate for it. And what taysir means, it's an easing of things, okay? And in which, again, for all the the idea that Sharia law is draconian, and it is. There are all sorts of dispensations, and taysir is essentially the way it's done. Taysir means to ease things. And again, it goes back and is, in short, summed up with the idea of al-niyya, intention. Okay, So as long as your intention is proper and accords with Islam and is on Islam's side, you can basically do anything. Okay, you can ease what Sharia demands of you. Okay, and he actually was speaking primarily about Muslims in the West. Okay, so what did he mean? He basically meant, oh, if you're in the West, well, obviously, uh, if you hear a blasphemer, a non-Muslim, and you should attack and kill him. Well, don't ease that because it's not good for you in the circumstance that you're in. Your intention is good. You want to kill him, but we also understand you don't want to get killed. Okay. So that's the depth of this sort of thing. Okay. All of which falls under the grand umbrella term Taqiyya, right? Taqiyya, Tawriya, Taysir, Kitman. Kitman, a lot of people talk about it. I find it the most innocuous. It just means to suppress and hold in truths that are if shared with the infidel are not advantageous to you. Okay, so you keep it to yourself. But they're all codified. They're all doctrines. They all trace back to Muhammad. They're all in the Quran. Okay, so deal with it. What I mean is, this is real business, and we see it constantly. I see it. Okay, I see it. I can discern it. I see it before my eyes. I know exactly what's happening, but too many non-Muslims, I'll just say, don't seem to see it and don't get it. Okay, it's a real thing. And again, to summarize, it all goes back. You don't even have to be caught up with the word Taqiyya. My earliest writing about all this, and I think the one that I wrote for the Jane's Islamic Affairs Analyst, I didn't even call it Taqiyya. I think I called it Islam's Doctrines of Deception, right? And because there's just too many, but Taqiyya is the most famous one, and it's become the sort of like the default word, which is fine. Okay, and like I told you, even scholars like the author of Al-Taqiyya fil Islam uses it in that sense. But again, the bottom line is Islam calls for constant hostility between Muslims and non-Muslims. It calls for the constant need to take over and conquer Islamic lands. It recognizes, of course, that when you're weak, there's only so much you can do. You can engage in taysir, which I just mentioned. You can engage in taqiyya and tawriya. You can do all that sort of thing. But the intention is still there, and your heart is with Islam, and you're not loving or you're not allying with the non-Muslims in any way, shape, or form. It's just an act. Like Abu Darda, Muhammad's companion, said, we smile to the face of infidels while our hearts curse them. Okay. All of that coalesces in the simple idea that, yeah, you have a free check to lie to the infidel, because one way or the other, you're doing it to help empower Islam. Okay. Now, let's see what you have to say. How's it going? Having a good day? It's early. It's very late where I'm at. It's actually midnight. So, all right. Kent, new member. Hey, thank you. Ground Zero gifted 10 memberships. Awesome. I hope they're grateful, these people. Kevin Yokum, thank you for your message, Raymond. God bless. God bless you too. Coltrane, part 1. I asked ChatGPT. Yeah, okay, GPT. I know I always say GBT. Okay, it's a P, I guess. Yes, I can pronounce P. BTila. Okay, I can do it. GPT. So I asked ChatGPT if Jesus or Muhammad was a better moral example, and it told me it couldn't answer because they had different roles and missions. It finally did admit Jesus was closer to moral. Yeah, I believe that. And keep in mind what we just saw about Muhammad, and GPT doesn't really get it. Tomcat, I learned something every time I watch a live. Thanks. I'm glad to hear it, Tomcat. Coltrane, part 2. Even I, after I told ChatGPT that Muhammad murdered, enslaved, coerced, and had relations with a child, Jesus was just closer instead of the personification of perfection in all aspects. I'm actually impressed they even gave you that. I think, when you talk with these AI things, they start knowing how you think. I think if you just approached it as a brand new computer or new browser or whatever, it probably wouldn't even concede that much. Edward, well, thanks. Pop the kettle on love. How are high trust societies supposed to function with deceptive societies without being destroyed? Good question. That's the problem. Western societies used to be, and still are to a certain degree, very high trust societies until certain elements start coming in. And then it's sad because maybe on the one hand, they don't become trust societies, which is unfortunate because everyone else is still somewhat trustworthy, the people of the original host population, the native population. But then you throw in this mix and now you either get exploited by the Muslim element who lie and deceive, or you become extra paranoid and now you don't believe anyone, including people who should be believed and should be trusted. It's unfortunate. Edward. Raymond. The Iranian peoples are rejecting the Islamic government in Iran. Doing so are educating the West about Islam and jihad. What are your thoughts? Could this be the beginning of the end of Islam? The Iran war? I don't know, because keep in mind, that's Shia Islam. So whatever happens to it in a way doesn't affect the Sunnis. In fact, as I understand it, Iran was attacking and shooting missiles at Sunni nations too, right? So that's the thing, you always hear about Iran as, I have to say this, I always find it a little weird because I understand we're fighting Iran. One of the reasons is because they're radical Muslims. Well, yeah, they're the theocracy, they're Shias. But I don't know, how legitimate is that excuse when we realize that the really, really radical Muslims are the Sunnis, especially the Wahhabis from Saudi Arabia and the other countries that we actually are good friends with. So I think it's a little more a realpolitik, and that's fine by me. Okay. This is not, of course, to take away from the Islamic element of Iran, Mahdiist Iran. I mean, I'm on board with that. I just don't think whatever happens is going to impact the Sunni, which is to say mainstream Muslim world, okay? Because they're already enemies theologically. They're already enemies temporarily in the now, because a lot of these Sunni countries, Gulf nations and whatnot are allied with the U.S. and Israel. But aside from that, I don't know. I don't think whatever the U.S. is doing is because Iran is some, radical Muslim nation. Not because it's not. I think it is, but there's worse, and we don't do anything with them. We're good friends. So I think it's realpolitik, and I think that's fine. Okay, but we should see it for what it is. That is what it is. Okay. Amit Yanuku, hello from Israel. You do important work. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Hello back to you. Lies destroy lives. How you doing, my friend? Okay. There's a great article about Islamic eschatology by Joel Richardson on the Answering Islam website. The option of living as a non-Muslim under Sharia will eventually be removed. Well, yeah. I think what you're referring to is the hadith that basically says in the end days, Jesus, Isa, Muslim Jesus, is going to come back and destroy the cross and kill the pigs. Okay. And that's two. The third is he's going to abrogate jizya. So what does that mean? Well, he's destroying the cross because, of course, Jesus hates the cross and Christians got it all wrong because he was never crucified or killed or resurrected, according to Islamic teaching. And he's going to kill the pig because, well, Muslims hate swine and Jesus is a good Muslim. But he's also going to cancel jizya, which means you can no longer pay tribute to be a Christian or a Jew. Okay, you must now convert or die. I think that's what you're talking about. And by the way, lest anyone think I'm minimizing the Islamic element of Iran, I actually just wrote an article on Substack about Mahdiism and how it impacts in a very negative way Shia Islam and Iran. And since we're talking about eschatology, of course, so the Mahdi is the end times figure, Muslim figure, which both Sunnis and Shias believe in. They have their different versions slightly, but and the Shias are much more committed to the Mahdi because it really accords with the imamates, and Iran is a 12er Shia, which basically they think the 12th Imam and the Imams are descended essentially kind of from Muhammad, but really Ali, I think, is the first Imam, and his descendants who are related to Muhammad through Fatima, his daughter. And they have different numbers. So like there's the 5ers and the 7ers and the 12ers. And each one of these numbers represents an imam. So the 5ers believe the 5th imam is the real final real imam. And, he's going to come back. And the 7th think that modern day Iran's 12ers. So they believe the 12th imam who went into occultation, I think in the 10th century, which is to say Allah plucked him out and is hiding him. He never died. And he's going to come back now, age 1200 or whatever, to wage the jihad and usher in the end times. I think the assassins, by the way, are 5ers, Nizaris, if I recall. Okay. But so, yeah, the Mahdi concept, which is really ingrained in Shiism, is a dangerous idea because amongst it is the idea that to help bring the Mahdi about, we have to confront Islam's greatest enemies, which happen to be the Satans, the two great Satans, Israel and the US. And so confronting them and annihilating them perhaps is seen as something that will bring about the end times. Okay, so that's especially dangerous. If you think about Iran having the idea of nuclear powers has historically been, balance of power. That if you have a nuke and I have a nuke, it's not so bad because what's going to happen is neither of us are going to push the button because we're both terrified of what happens. Because if you push it, I'm pushing it, and we both die. But if you're driven by these sort of eschatological, apocalyptic visions, and you feel like you're obligated, like the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is actually especially indoctrinated in Mahdiism, and you feel somewhat obligated to help usher it in, well, things can get really messy and ugly, obviously. Anyway, so there it is. Christy Avram. So Islam is very materialistic, preserving one's life by any means. That is very modern and leftist. Well, why do you think the left and Islam love each other so much? Of course it is. The left, just like Islam, the end justifies the mean, right? That's how leftists think. The idea of the end justifies the means is very much an unethical idea. Okay. But it is very prominent amongst leftists, as they're called, and the Muslims. Okay. In other words, instead of having an ethical system that you follow, okay, like early Christians would rather die than renounce Christ, for example, that would be a strong ethical system. No, in this case, hey, if I'm saving my life, and maybe after I save my life, I can even empower Islam or the left, right? Then why don't I say and do whatever? Okay. Yeah, it's very materialistic. It's very worldly. And now you know why they are good friends. Mort Rauch, have you ever worked with Sarah Adams? No. Her specialty is anti-terrorism of Middle Eastern flavor. Channel is the watch floor. You'd have some synergistic information to share with each other. You're in a similar wheelhouse. Well, okay. Thanks for letting me know. I will duly make a note of it. Okay. Das Barbara, I just realized Assassin's Creed is a propaganda game for Islam. Yeah, it is. Ubisoft company based in France. Call me paranoid, but it fits a bit too well. I've heard other people. I've never played it, but I'm familiar with Assassin's Creed. And I once tried to watch the first 10 minutes. I believe there's a movie based on it. And it was appalling because it was just completely noble assassins and evil Templars, as usual. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm sure there's an agenda there. Okay. Lies destroy lives. That's a, hey, so hey, lies destroy lives. You're against Taqiyya. Your entire name is anti lies. Good for you. The Islamic world is under a curse because of a demon who claims to be the one true God. The demon's goal is to deceive and steal and kill and destroy. I've been reflecting lately upon something, which is, you know, if you look at the world around us right now, deception is so permeates everything, right? Everything now is just a lie. And, who's the father of lies? Satan, right? It all comes back. It all makes sense in a way. But I don't know. Call me paranoid, but I've reached the point where, I don't know, if I can't verify something for myself independently, it's probably a lie. I hate to be that paranoid, and I'm not necessarily saying that's exactly how I think, but it kind of is at this point. You got to be extra careful nowadays. The lies are just so manifold. Okay. Lies destroy lives. To uphold a lie for God's sake is to be against God, not for him. God cannot be lied for. He is the truth. The truth alone is on his side. George MacDonald, Unspoken Sermons. Good one. Thanks for bringing good old George into the picture. Yeah. And for whoever doesn't know, George MacDonald's an amazing, awesome theologian. I believe he was Scottish from the 19th century. You should get his book, Unspoken Sermons. I think it's on Amazon. You can get it. Very, very, very good stuff. Dickasonk became a YouTube member. Hey, thanks. Welcome aboard. Bite Mash. Raymond, that cup of tea must be stone cold by now. Keep doing what you're doing, a true warrior of Christ, in Jesus' name. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. Well, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. Crazivon. Thanks so much for your work. I work with a Coptic man. Showed him sword and scimitar. He said, you are exactly correct in what you say. He told me about Coptic life in Egypt, second-class citizens. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, you got to live it to know it. And obviously that man does. Adam Barnard. Hello, Mr. Raymond. I admire and respect your work. Thank you very much for all that you do. Would you consider recording yourself reading your books for the people who like to listen to audiobooks? I've gotten that request many times, and I wouldn't mind doing it. The only problem is the books I write, they're with the publisher. I sign contracts, and they usually just assign it to professional companies who do that. And I don't even know what's going on. They just do their thing. But I, for one, have no problem doing it. So maybe for future books, I'll look into that. I'll fight you. Oh, I'll fight you naked. I'm okay. Is the Al Qaeda reader available anywhere? I think the paperback is still should be available. I think on Amazon. You might check. It's also available on my website for a donation, and you'll get a signature. Jake Dunnigan became a YouTube member. Welcome aboard, Jake. Jake, I hope you have security and keep your whereabouts secret. Not the former, but the latter. I try. Yeah. Also, since Islam is a religion and a political party like communism, how does a country like the US stop the spread of it? Well, I've been talking a lot about that, the Sharia, the Sharia hearings and all that business. And, you can call it a religion all you want. And it is a religion. I'm not going to argue that it's not a religion, but it comes with so many things that are not again. See, this is the Western mentality, the Western projection, because to the Western mentality, separation of church and state, that idea, okay, render unto Caesar. Okay, and so now we think every religion is like that. Okay, well, not Islam. Sorry, Islam is all about what you do. It's all about policy. Okay, day to day life. Okay, what you do, how you live, how you think. It's totalitarian like that. So that's why I find, and I've said this, I've made videos and I've written about this recently, that it's good that so many Western, we're having Sharia hearings and talking about political Islam. That's great. And a lot of these are politicians like Greg Abbott in Texas who will, loudly condemn Sharia, which is good. I commend him for that. Okay. But at the same time, he'll never say a word against Islam. And so, and that seems to be a lot of people nowadays. And it's kind of like, they're synonymous. Okay. Islam and Sharia, as I describe them, are two sides of one coin. One is just is the descriptive word. It's called Islam. One, Sharia, is its prescriptive application, how you do it. Okay. So one word is what it is, what it's known as. One is how you be a Muslim. So I just find it's one of those, disconnects of people who just, on the one hand, it's progress. At least you're recognizing there's an element, something called Sharia, that's problematic. On the other hand, you're still not getting that, this Sharia thing is not some weird add-on that radicals do, but most Muslims don't. It's actually Islam itself. So that's the problem. How does, in as much as what I'm saying is, to go to your question, which is, in a political party, like, how does a country like the US stop the spread of it? To go to your question, it's, people are starting to get the idea that, Islam comes with all this baggage that contradicts US law and you can't have it. So a lot of politicians will say, there's no way, there's no room here for Sharia. Okay, well, now, eventually, ideally, they're going to step it up and understand, well, that is Islam. It's not like Islam is Muslims acting like Westerners and Christians and secularists, and then there's some core group that like to do this thing called Sharia. No, that is what it is to be a Muslim, is to do Sharia. Okay, so when Greg Abbott and all these others, and I only mentioned him because I read a lot about what he says, say things like, there's no place for Sharia here. Okay, good. But what you don't realize is what you just said is there's no place for Islam. All right. And I guess that's the next step that a country needs to understand, because if you are against Sharia, then how are you for Islam? They're, like I said, they're just two sides of one coin. Crazavon, socialism and communism are also utilitarian. Yeah, that's how the left, communism, and Islam company together. They share a similar ethical framework. Yeah, that's kind of what I was saying about, to them, that is utilitarian. The end justifies the means. Okay, as long as I think my end is good and altruistic because I'm an ideologue and I'm subjective and I don't understand that others don't think the way I do and what I believe must be correct. Okay, that's leftism, that's Islam. And then, you know what, I can do whatever to achieve hegemony because that's good. And the others will come around eventually. And so what if I take some shortcuts along the way? Adam Barnard. Playing Assassin's Creed as a kid, you like the assassins. Grown up, you realize the Templars were actually super based. Yes, they were. And for those of you who haven't done so, get the book on the Templars and the Hospitallers to see just how super based they are, including the little anecdote I told you that no one else has mentioned about how they saw through Muslim deceptions, the Taqiyya. Lies Destroy Lives. Unspoken Sermons is available online for free. Okay, good. Now you've all been told. Go get it and read them. And if I recall, they're chapters. Each one's a sermon. I think the one I really liked, and I think a lot of people like it, it's called The Justice of God, I think. But I actually like them all. And look, it's available for free. Go read one chapter. Go read a sermon. If you call yourself a Christian, you owe it to read one of these sermons, I think. And let me know what you think. Scarlet Rose. Well, thank you. Das Barba. Regarding Assassin's Creed, you guys are really into the Assassin's Creed. The movie is just a bad movie. You should look at the first 3 game story playthroughs. The propaganda is appalling. Ugh, I'm sure it is. I don't need to look at anything else that's more appalling. I see appalling daily. So I'll pass on this, but thanks for the info. Nicked 1552. I appreciate your great work. Not many talk about the history of the Ottomans and the Balkans. Great that you do. Thanks from a Bulgarian atheist. Well, thank you. Yeah, I do talk a lot about. I do try to talk a lot about Ottomans in Eastern Europe and the Balkans and whatnot. And you're right, they're not mentioned, and more is the pity because they are amongst our most recent and therefore well-recorded histories. So if you really want to know what's if Islamic animosity vis-a-vis Christians and Europeans, you should look at what happened in the Balkans because it's the most recent iteration, aside from, things like the genocide of Armenians, which is sort of similar because the Armenians, Caucasus, I suppose, Anatolian Christians, same sort of story. But yeah, that is the case. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining me. And I hope this was edifying to you. And until next time, take care, be well, and farewell. Bye.